It was one of those ordinary mornings that you barely remember as time passes. The sky was overcast, and the air carried the scent of rain that refused to fall. To me, it felt like just another day in high school, a routine as dull as the fluorescent-lit hallways, their flickering lights humming softly above. I never imagined that morning would become one of the scariest days of my life. My name is Ethan, and I was 15 years old at the time. Before classes began, I was hanging out in the courtyard with a few friends, chatting about random things, everything from the newest video game to the tests no one wanted to take. When the bell rang, we said our goodbyes and headed off in different directions. On my way to class, the hallway was emptying out quickly. Most students had already entered their classrooms, leaving only the sound of hurried footsteps from those running late. I was never the type to rush. My teacher, Mr. Thompson, was laid back and often arrived late himself, busy with something related to the school's basketball team. So I wasn't worried about being on time. Then the second bell rang, and suddenly, everything changed. The school intercom crackled to life, and the principal's voice echoed through the hallways. "Attention students and staff, we are now in lockdown. This is not a drill. Follow lockdown procedures immediately." Lockdown? My heart skipped a beat. Sure, we'd practiced lockdown drills before, but the tone of the principal's voice was different, too serious. The hallway around me fell into an eerie silence, like the entire building was holding its breath. I thought maybe it was a mistake or something minor, so I kept walking, trying not to overthink it. But as I approached my classroom, a strange feeling began to settle over me, a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Something was wrong. And then I saw him. At the end of the hallway, near my classroom, stood a man dressed entirely in black. He wore a ski mask that revealed only his eyes, and a large bag hung from his shoulder. For a few seconds I froze, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. He didn't look like a staff member or anyone who should have been there. The way he stood, shoulders tense and head moving slowly, sent a chill down my spine. Then he turned his head toward me. I stopped breathing. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back down the hallway, my legs barely able to keep up with the adrenaline flooding my system. I knew I couldn't go to my classroom. He was right in front of it. I ran until I found the door to the boys' bathroom. I slipped inside and quietly closed the door behind me, making as little noise as possible. I hid in one of the stalls and sat on the floor, hugging my knees. Why was he here? What was happening? Questions swirled in my mind as I tried to control my breathing. The silence around me was deafening, and every small noise seemed magnified. The hum of the lights, the sound of my own shallow breaths. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and then I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, almost dragging, but deliberate. My heart raced again. He can't come in here. He can't come in here. I repeated this mantra to myself, clinging to the hope that he wouldn't find me. The footsteps passed by the bathroom door but didn't come inside. I waited a few more minutes, trembling, until the sound faded into silence. Finally, I gathered the courage to leave the stall. The hallway was empty, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear again. As I turned a corner to look for an exit, I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time faster, closer. I spun around and saw him. The man was there, rounding the corner. At that moment, I started running like I'd never run before. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, driven purely by instinct as I sprinted down the hallway. Each footstep echoed like gunshots in my mind, amplifying the fear that consumed me. Behind me, the man's footsteps grew louder. He was running now, and I could feel his presence closing in. I turned left, then right, trying to recall every shortcut I knew in the school, but everything seemed unfamiliar, as if the hallways had rearranged themselves. My only goal was to escape. For the first time, I wished the school wasn't so large. The labyrinth of corridors that once felt like home now seemed endless, and the sensation of being hunted made it all the more suffocating. Amid the chaos, I spotted the emergency exit at the end of the hallway. Hope surged within me. There was my chance to get away. With my lungs burning, I threw myself against the door, pushing it open with all my strength. The cool outside air hit me, but there was no time to stop and breathe. I scanned the area and saw police officers in the front parking lot. They hadn't noticed me yet, so I ran as fast as I could toward them, waving frantically. "Help! He's inside the school!" I shouted with everything I had left. The officers sprang into action immediately. Some ran toward the building while others came to me. They surrounded me, asking what had happened. I could barely speak, but I pointed toward the school, struggling to explain that the man was still inside, near the classrooms. One officer tried to calm me down while another spoke into his radio. I caught snippets of phrases like "armed suspect" and "secure the area," but it was hard to process anything in the moment. From that point on, everything happened too fast. More police cars arrived within minutes, and the officers quickly established a perimeter around the school. The piercing wail of sirens filled the air, blending with the shouts of commands. As the officers entered the building, I sat on the curb trying to catch my breath. One officer stayed with me, assuring me that everything would be okay. But how could he know that? The masked man was still inside, and I had no idea what he wanted or what he was capable of doing. Minutes felt like hours until I heard a muffled explosion, followed by a heavy silence that seemed to stretch forever. Finally, a voice crackled through the radio, confirming that the man had been apprehended. When I saw the officers escorting him out in handcuffs, my breathing began to steady. The man kept his head down, but even so, I recognized his mask and the bag slung over his shoulder. I didn't know who he was, but seeing him taken away brought an overwhelming sense of relief. Later, I learned that he hadn't been armed, but his bag was filled with strange items: ropes, knives, and duct tape. No one could say for sure what he had been planning, and the police didn't share many details. After that day, my school implemented permanent security measures, and all entrances became tightly monitored. My family insisted I start seeing a therapist, and though I resisted at first, it eventually helped me process the trauma. 7 years have passed since that day, and I still think about it from time to time. The fear, the adrenaline, the feeling of being hunted, those are experiences I wouldn't wish on anyone. But something positive came from it. I learned to appreciate each day as if it were unique, because you never know when the most mundane routine could transform into something that changes your life forever. My name is Jason, and to this day, every time I see a red sweater, a chill runs down my spine. It doesn't matter if it's in a store window or on someone walking down the street, the memory returns like a shadow that never leaves me. It all began on a day that should have been ordinary, but ended up completely altering my sense of safety and peace. I was 18 years old and a senior in high school. It was one of those gray days with a humid atmosphere that seemed to foreshadow something strange. During the fourth class of the day, I was struggling to keep my eyes open through a tedious geometry lecture when the principal's voice suddenly cut through the intercom. "Attention, students and staff. This is a Code Red situation. I repeat, Code Red. Follow lockdown protocols immediately." For a second, the room fell silent, followed by a nervous murmur spreading among the students. Our teacher, Mrs. Caldwell, reacted quickly. She told us all to move to the back of the room and lock the door. The lights were turned off, and the tension in the air became palpable. The classroom, a space for learning and laughter just moments ago, transformed into a refuge. All we could hear was our restrained breathing and the occasional distant sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. Every noise seemed amplified, and our eyes were glued to the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any second. Most of the students were silent, though I could feel the rising panic in the air. Some sent quick texts on their phones trying to find out what was happening. Others, like me, sat frozen, unable to do anything but wait. For long minutes that felt like hours. There was no movement outside. But then, the heavy sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. At first, they were slow and deliberate, as though the person knew exactly where they were going. Then they became quicker, almost urgent, growing louder as they approached our room. My heart pounded so hard I feared it might give us away. When the footsteps finally stopped outside our door, the tension became unbearable. Suddenly, the doorknob began to turn slowly. The entire room froze. No one dared breathe. The silence was broken by a muffled, low, gravelly voice. "I know you're in there." It was a simple sentence, but it carried a weight of menace. No one responded, of course, but the sense of helplessness was suffocating. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the person stopped turning the knob and began knocking on the door. First lightly, then harder, until it sounded like they were punching it. The sound reverberated through the room, and I was certain the door wouldn't hold much longer. Then, as abruptly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence returned, but it was even more oppressive now. We didn't know if he was still there or had moved on to another classroom. Mrs. Caldwell motioned for us to stay still and silent. It was then that we heard something even more terrifying, the sound of glass shattering nearby. He had moved to another part of the school, but that did nothing to ease our fear. We knew the danger was still close. As we waited, time seemed to stretch endlessly. I tried to control my breathing and stay calm, but it was impossible. My muscles were taut, as if ready to spring into action at any moment to save myself. Finally, the distant sound of sirens broke the deadly silence. We heard the clatter of police entering the building, firm footsteps and authoritative voices echoing through the hallways. Only then did we allow ourselves to feel a sliver of relief. The principal's voice returned over the intercom, this time announcing that the situation was under control and the lockdown would soon be lifted. When the lights came back on and the door was unlocked, most of us still couldn't move. Though the immediate threat was over, the sense of vulnerability remained. The man in the red sweater had vanished, but the fear he instilled left its mark on all of us. After the lockdown was lifted, the tension still hung over the school like a ghost. We were instructed to leave the classroom calmly and gather in the auditorium. The authorities wanted to keep us together while they conducted a final sweep of the building. I joined the other students in the hallway, but my legs were still shaky. The memory of the doorknob turning and the man's voice echoed relentlessly in my mind. When I arrived at the auditorium, I spotted my friend Caleb waving to me from a row near the back. I sat down next to him, but neither of us spoke much. The atmosphere was heavy. "Did you see him?" Caleb finally whispered, as if speaking aloud might summon the danger back. "I did. And I heard him too," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "He was right outside my classroom." Caleb nodded, but didn't ask anything more. I could tell he was just as shaken as I was. While we sat in the auditorium, police officers entered to speak with us. One of them, Sergeant Miller, stood on the stage with a serious posture and a firm voice. "I want you all to know that we're doing everything in our power to ensure your safety," he began. "The individual has been identified as a suspect with a history of trespassing. We've gathered important leads, but he is still at large." My mind spun. He was still out there? That meant the danger wasn't over. We were dismissed early that day, but teachers urged us to go straight home and avoid staying out. As I left, I glanced over my shoulder with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, my mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner. I told her what had happened, omitting a few details to avoid scaring her too much. "That's awful, Jason," she exclaimed, visibly alarmed. "I'm calling the school. They need to do more to keep you safe." I nodded, trying to hide how shaken I still felt. After dinner, I went to my room, but the silence in the house only made things worse. Every little sound seemed suspicious, and every shadow seemed to move. Around 8 p.m., I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I went to the window and looked out, seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked across the street. I didn't recognize it, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Probably just someone visiting a neighbor, I thought, trying to calm my nerves. But the car didn't leave. Minutes passed and it stayed there. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was wearing a red sweater. My heart raced and a chill ran down my spine. He looked directly at my house, and for a moment, I thought our eyes met. I ran to the phone and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. "There's a man. He was at my school earlier. I think he's outside my house now." As I waited for the police to arrive, the man started walking toward my house. I couldn't move, frozen with fear. He stopped in the middle of the street, staring up at my bedroom window. Moments later, the sound of police sirens shattered the stillness of the night. The man turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness before the officers could catch him. The police searched the area but found no trace of him. One of the officers assured me that they would have a patrol in the neighborhood for the next few days. Despite their reassurances, I knew that wouldn't be the last time I thought about the man in the red sweater. The police never confirmed whether he was caught, and the weeks that followed were filled with constant fear. I avoided going out alone, checked locks and windows obsessively, and stayed hyper-aware of my surroundings. Today, years later, I still think about that night. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but something tells me that if the police hadn't arrived when they did, my story would have ended very differently. My name is Jake Thompson, and for me, that Tuesday started like any other day. I was late for class, as usual, running with a half-open backpack and a handful of cereal. I was never the type of student who impressed teachers or stood out in sports. My only goal was to fly under the radar, and that morning, I thought I was doing just that. The third class of the day was history, and I reached the hallway to the classroom just as Mr. Carter was closing the door. I slipped in quietly, hoping to avoid his gaze, but luck wasn't on my side. "Mr. Thompson, good morning. I trust your grand entrance means you've brought the answer to my challenge from last class." The class chuckled, and I just shook my head awkwardly. Before the lecture could continue, the door opened again, and the office assistant walked in holding a note. "Mr. Carter, this is for Jake." All eyes turned to me as I walked to the front of the room. I took the note and read the hastily written words. "Jake, I'm at the side exit to pick you up." "Mom?" I was confused. My mom never sent notes, and I couldn't think of a reason why she'd be picking me up early. I glanced at Mr. Carter, who just shrugged and resumed the lesson. I grabbed my things and left the room, a strange feeling settling over me. As I walked through the quiet hallways, the only sounds were the muffled voices of teachers from nearby classrooms. The day felt darker than usual, with heavy clouds looming in the sky. When I reached the side exit, I looked around, but my mom's car wasn't there. That's when I noticed a black SUV parked farther down, near the gate. The passenger window rolled down, and a woman I didn't recognize, wearing sunglasses and a stiff smile, waved at me. "Jake, over here, sweetheart. Your mom asked me to pick you up." I froze, my mind racing with questions. I didn't recognize this woman, and something about her tone felt off. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my distance. "I'm Anna, a friend of your mom's," she replied. "She had something urgent to take care of and asked me to come get you." I glanced at the SUV again, my heart pounding. A man sat in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. "No, thank you. I'll wait for my mom here," I said, taking a step back. The woman's smile faded, her expression hardening. "Jake, don't be silly. Your mom will be upset if you don't come with me." Before I could respond, the rear door of the SUV opened, and a tall man in a black jacket and boots stepped out. He started walking toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing in the parking lot. That's when my survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking twice, I turned and bolted back into the school. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. I reached the main doors and yanked the handle, but they were locked. I glanced back. The man was closer now, his expression cold and calculating. With no other choice, I ran around the building, aiming for the entrance near the front office. My only thought was to find an adult, someone who could help. As I ran, I felt the constant sensation of being watched, every sound sharpening my panic. Turning a corner, I heard the quickening rhythm of footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I knew that if I hesitated for even a moment, it would be over. I ran with every ounce of strength my legs could muster, rounding the school building and reaching the main entrance doors. I pounded on them desperately, the sound echoing through the empty hallways, but no one came. I was alone outside, and the man in the black jacket was closing the distance fast. I thought about screaming, but I knew I needed to act quickly before he caught up to me. I decided to head back toward the parking lot, hoping to find an adult, maybe a teacher or even a late student. But as soon as I turned, I saw the black SUV's headlights flick on and the vehicle creep forward slowly. The woman was still inside, her face now devoid of the fake friendliness she'd shown earlier. "There's no use running, Jake," the man shouted. His voice was cold, carrying a triumphant tone that sent chills down my spine. I realized they were trying to trap me, so I bolted in the opposite direction, heading toward the soccer field surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. On the other side was a small gate that led to a side street. Maybe, just maybe, if I could make it there, I could escape and find help. My mind raced. Who were these people? How did they know my name? And worst of all, what did they want with me? As I sprinted across the field, my legs burned, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Behind me, I could hear the man's footsteps getting closer. He was fast, much faster than I'd anticipated. When I glanced back, he was only a few meters away, and to my horror, he was holding something in his hand, a syringe. My heart pounded even harder. He wasn't just trying to catch me, he had a plan, and whatever it was, it terrified me to my core. I reached the gate, only to find it locked. Panic surged through me as I tried to climb it, my hands trembling and slipping on the cold metal. I could feel him closing in, his heavy footsteps pounding against the ground with alarming speed. Then in the distance, I heard sirens. The police! Hope flooded through me as I glanced over my shoulder. The man heard them too, and he stopped abruptly. His expression shifted from predatory to frustrated. He turned toward the SUV, which was now reversing and speeding away from the parking lot. I kept climbing, pushing myself over the top of the gate with every ounce of strength I had left. As I finally dropped onto the other side, I saw 2 police cars turning onto the side street. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Stop right there!" one of them yelled at the man. He hesitated for a moment, but then turned and ran in the opposite direction, trying to escape. I collapsed onto my knees on the sidewalk, gasping for air as I watched the scene unfold. The officers chased after him, and after a few tense minutes, I saw him being tackled and handcuffed. They dragged him back to one of the squad cars as he shouted incoherent words I couldn't make out. One of the officers approached me, kneeling down to meet my eye level. "Are you okay, kid?" he asked, his voice calm but serious. I could barely speak. Tears streamed down my face as the adrenaline finally began to wear off. I nodded, too overwhelmed to do much else. "Who were those people?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky. "We'll find out," he replied. "The important thing is you're safe now." In the days that followed, I learned that the man and woman were wanted in multiple states for abductions. They had a pattern of creating fake notes and luring unsuspecting kids. My case was just the latest in a series of attempts, many of which, tragically, hadn't ended as well as mine. My school implemented stricter security measures after the incident, including reinforced doors and more rigorous ID checks for anyone entering the building. Despite these changes, it took me months to feel safe again. Years later, I still remember the sound of those sirens and the overwhelming relief I felt when I saw the police arrive. I know I was lucky, but I also learned to never ignore my instincts. That experience changed the way I view the world, teaching me to be more cautious and to trust the warning signs when something feels wrong. What could have been the worst day of my life became a lesson I'll never forget.